Sigma Psi lecture, first Sigma Psi. I'm Murray Kaplan. I'm president of the ISU chapter of Sigma Psi. I just want to tell you a couple of things about Sigma Psi. Sigma Psi is a national scientific and engineering honor society. One can be nominated into it by your professors. If you engage in research, either at the undergraduate or graduate level, there's certain criteria that have to be met. Usually for associate membership, it's a presentation of a scientific paper at a scientific meeting, usually a national meeting. And for full membership, requires publications in a refereed journal. If you get elected to this honor, you can have this honor put on your transcript as a permanent record that you've been recognized by the National Scientific Honor Society. The sciences includes engineering, all the natural sciences, mathematics, and social sciences are recognized in the society. We sponsor a series of lectures from using national distinguished lecturers, such as the Ted Rockwell that we have here tonight, and plus local lecturers. We also participate in the awards for graduate and undergraduate research as part of Sigma Psi, and this year we're going to try and we may start up a poster session for undergraduate research. We're going to try and get that going, and we're going to get organized in that. If it doesn't work for this year, it'll certainly work for next year. So that's all I'm going to tell you about our National Society. There will be a question period after the presentation. I'll ask you to please go to the microphone to ask your questions so that other people can hear your questions. And after we finish the question and answer period, there'll be some refreshments. So if you want the refreshments, you have to stick around. Now I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Jaylin Jain, who's the president-elect of the ISU chapter in charge of this year's program. Dr. Jaylin Jain.
Good evening. It's a great honor and a pleasure for me to introduce tonight's National Honor Lecturer, Dr. Theodore Rockwell. Dr. Rockwell is a member of Academy of Engineering, and so this is the first Academy of Engineering sponsored Sigma Psi Honor Lecture. And Dr. Rockwell has been working over 60 years, it's impressive, in nuclear reaction and nuclear power. And Dr. Rockwell is a fellow of American Nuclear Society, and he received a first ANS Lifetime Contribution Award. Now the award is named after him, so now it's Rockwell Award. And there is a long list of honors that he has received. And he was technical director of Admiral Hyman Rickover's program. Rickover, to build the nuclear navy and the first world commercial atomic power station. That's in Pennsylvania. And also he has quite a few patents, and one of his patents actually is the foundation of all other patents. And so it is a great honor and pleasure to have Dr. Rockwell here to tell us his career achievement on nuclear power and the related subject. Okay, let's welcome Dr. Rockwell.
Is everybody where they can see the screen? All right, or am I standing in the way of it? It's hard to pick a spot. Well, Jaylin told me that my job here is to talk, and your job is to listen. And if you finish before I do, raise your hand, and we'll see if we can work something out. There were several options of what subjects to talk about, and one was more provocative, and that's the one that she chose. But these are three different doors that lead into the same room. The data are the same that you have to deal with. So this part of the thing, the heresy and excommunication, those are terms that we think of as being applied in religious communities where dogma is the thing and adherence to the dogma is essential. But we seekers of pure truth think we're above beyond all that. And what I'd like to talk about a little bit is that that may be a more active activity in the scientific community than you might think about. And it's because human beings and institutions of human beings are pretty much the same, whether you're talking about political parties or a scientific society or a church. Institutions want to preserve themselves, and the people in the institutions want to preserve themselves. You usually associate that problem of heresy as a charge of heresy says you're not speaking legitimate truth, and you don't belong in this organization, and you get excommunicated. You're not allowed in the organization. Those things are terms that, as I say, aren't usually used, but we'll talk a little bit about when they do show up. The first place they show up, and that's not surprising, is when you get into fields at the edges of science which are considered disreputable fields. And in the same sense that for a long time music professionals didn't want to consider jazz as a legitimate art form. It was played in bordellos and not in concert halls, and so there are areas of science that fall in that category. For a long time, for example, scientists didn't want to admit the existence of the subconscious, of hypnosis. A demonstration was used of hypnosis as an anesthesia for an amputation. And they actually sawed a guy's leg off with hypnosis as the only anesthesia. And the doctors that were brought in to witness this decided that the whole thing was a fake, that the patient was in cahoots with the doctor and he was just pretending he didn't feel it when they sawed his leg off. That's how far people will go to preserve the status quo of their own worldview. But I want to talk about an area of science which is safely in the middle of mainstream science. It happens to be a field I'm interested in, the effects of radiation on organisms, and particularly organisms like you and me. And so radiation protection is a subject that you would think would not be considered disreputable, but nonetheless we have this kind of a problem. This little androgynous critter here is taken from a book called Has Radiation Protection Become a Health Hazard? By a very noted Swedish radiobiologist. And that's a very important question to think about. How can a radiation protection system become a health hazard, something set up to protect people's health? And I'll get into that because this is what's happened. The first thing that happened in connection with radiation, of course, when it first came in, it was sort of looked at as the elixir of life. It was a wonderful thing. People were taking radium things, radium and radioactivity were incorporated into every kind of thing you could think of, and it was all very wonderful. And then some people got burned, and then suddenly, all of a sudden, this is something maybe we should worry about. And of course, people were not slow to recognize that if you've got something that is not well known and is dangerous, there are people that are going to give you money to research this. And so, sure enough, the more dangerous and the more mysterious you can make something look, the longer you can keep studying it. And so, this is where you start getting into trouble. Radiation has had fear associated with it for a long time. And the fear is not without consequences. When you scare people continuously, there are consequences to that. And in my little hometown paper outside of Washington, D.C., these headlines appeared. It says, radon is the single largest health hazard. Now here's a town where we got snipers shooting at people, we got automobiles knocking people down, we got all kinds of different diseases and problems, but radon is the largest single health hazard. Does anybody really believe that? And this is, I mean, you know, when was the last time you saw an obituary that says she died in bed after a long bout with radon? You know? But that was the story that was going out, and a lot of money was going into studying radon. And there's a whole radon remediation industry growing up. You look in the yellow pages, it didn't used to be there. The guy that really started this off was an electrical worker in Pennsylvania on a nuclear power plant that was being built. And this guy set off the alarm one day when he walked through the scanning portal that they have to measure radiation. Now, the interesting thing about it was he was walking from the outside in, and second, they hadn't installed any radioactivity in the plant yet. They had installed the monitoring system, but they didn't have the core, they didn't have... So this guy is ringing bells, and it turns out that he had a very high natural level of radon in his home. Big panic, you know. Well, for 10 years, a lot of us have been trying to tell the EPA and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that they were setting the standards tighter and tighter, the permissible levels lower and lower in these nuclear power plants, and they had people that were required to get less radiation at work than they had from the natural God's good green earth at home. And we kept telling them that this was an inconsistency, you know, it didn't make sense, they ought to resolve that problem. And they kept saying, go away, boy, you bother me. And about 1990, they suddenly flipped around. And the Environmental Protection Agency, which was set up to protect poor, defenseless nature against the ravages of technological mankind, was suddenly characterized as the silent killer in your home. And they were running public service announcements on television where they show the happy American family gathered around the television set. And they all look very happy, and this commercial is going on about the radon that is seeping into the home, and suddenly they all become skeletons. Even the dog becomes a skeleton. And people raised such a howl about this, they finally took it off. I mean, it was a disgraceful sort of a thing. But just deliberate fear, because they said they couldn't get people to spend a lot of money to try to remediate radon in their homes. And just to go to a punchline on that particular point, I was present at the news conference when the latest report came out announcing the statistics on which these headlines are based. That they were killing, and they made a number of how many people are being killed each year, tens of thousands, which they give to three significant figures, plus or minus 40%. And it's still a phony number. But one of the reporters asked a very important question, and I was sorry to see nobody picked it up in the papers. But this guy said at the last thing, they were getting ready to close up the news conference, and this guy said, I would like to hear from each member of the committee what he or she is doing about radon in their own home. Reasonable question, right? So everybody looks at everybody else, you know, and finally one guy said, well, I don't smoke, so it's not a problem for me. And that didn't fly very well. So the chairman said, well, I checked the radon in my home, he said. Well, fine, what did you find and what did you do about it? Well, you know, these numbers are something, mutter, and we got to get on to other things. So these guys were telling us we should spend billions of dollars on this terrible problem. We're not willing to spend $15 to check the radon in their own home, which is all it costs to get one of those little canisters and check it, you know. So that has implications, and that's the second headline. Radon fear sparks drop in breast exams. The guys that were running the mammograph units said they were having trouble getting people to come in. A woman would call up, she'd be really upset, she'd discovered a lump in her breast. They'd say, come on in and we'll give you an examination and see what we can do about it. No, sir, I understand you guys use radiation. I'm not going to have that. Radiation causes cancer, you know. So this is how radiation protection system can become a health hazard. So let's get into that in a little more detail. we finally got to the point where people were putting out statements like this one I'm about to show you here. This is a statement that was put out by the Secretary of Energy. The Secretary of Energy, I can move it down a little bit too. Let's just kind of get it up so. The Secretary of Energy now has no regulatory responsibilities. When they changed the old Atomic Energy Act, which both promoted and regulated atomic energy, and people said, hey, that's a conflict of interest. So they peeled it off. They set up a National Nuclear Regulatory Commission to do the regulation, and the Secretary of Energy was therefore free to promote nuclear energy under the Atomic Energy Act. So this is what this guy says. Radiation-induced cancers. We estimate that over the next 30 years there will be between 250 and 700 radiation-induced cancers among DOE, that's Department of Energy, contract employees, of which about 60% will result in death. It's an official Department of Energy news release. Absolutely no valid basis for such a statement. I called the Secretary's office the next morning when I saw this in the papers and said, I want to see the report this is based on. Well, it isn't exactly based on a report. Well, what is it based on? You know, well, we expect to have a vigorous public discussion of this thing. This is just to open the discussion. And of course, they never had such a discussion. But this was the basis for starting the Nuclear Workers' Compensation Act, which says that all these, quote, Cold War heroes who worked in the nuclear plant, Cold War hero being somebody like me, who is in a good paying job doing what he likes while other people are getting shot at. You know, and I don't know how this makes a guy a hero, I don't know. But they want to compensate all these guys because they were working in an ultra-hazardous field. And so the next thing you know, there's a congressional thing that says it is the sense of Congress that since World War II, federal nuclear activity has been explicitly recognized by the U.S. government as an ultra-hazardous activity under federal law. Well, that's a statement that's easy to prove or disprove. They've got statistics on nuclear workers. And the fact of the matter is that their longevity is 25% greater than the public at large, that the cancer rate is lower and so forth. So that statement doesn't make any sense at all. And goes on down. Another statement that is obviously impossible to prove. Furthermore, studies indicate that 98% of radiation-induced cancers within the DOE complex occur at dose levels below existing maximum safe thresholds. There's no way you can prove a statement like that, and it's obviously nonsense. But that is the basis on which the people who passed that law are greeted by workers as heroes for getting the money. They're never going to get any money. In the first place, the money is going to come out of a different kitty at a different year, and they're going to have to prove that they were actually damaged by radiation, and they're not being damaged by radiation, so they're not going to get any money. But meanwhile, these guys have made their point. So after 9/11, there was a lot of increased uproar. Incidentally, the Secretary of Navy who made that previous statement, the Secretary of Energy who made that statement that I showed you, is now working on the board of directors of a big anti-nuclear organization, just to show you how these things work. They said that they thought he was an excellent Secretary of Energy. So after 9/11, people began to use that as an excuse that, gee, we better shut down all these nuclear power plants because they're so vulnerable, and it'll be unprecedented catastrophe if anything ever happens to any of them. And so we got an article published. I made got an op-ed in the Washington Post, Radiation Chicken Little. That's their head, not mine. I just called it Getting Real. But this was talking about a drill that they had. It was an off-the-record drill where they had all the top civil defense people together from the mayor's office, the White House, and so forth, and they did a drill, a dirty bomb drill. A dirty bomb is ordinary explosive with some radioactivity wrapped around it, and the theory is that this is going to cause a big problem. So they were doing this drill, and the guy who was running is David Gergen, who is a well-known public figure, and he was trying to get some action out of these guys, and of course they didn't have enough data. The drill was marching along, and he said, look, radiation is killing people, you know, they're going into the hospitals, overwhelming the facilities, and you guys are just sitting there. And I said, David, there isn't enough radioactivity in a dirty bomb to hurt anybody. All you have to do is walk a block away, and you're all right. And he says, gee, that's not what the scientists and the regulators are telling us. And I said, you're asking them the wrong question. What you're telling me is what it takes to make a pristine, clear, surgically clean piece of ground, and that's not what you worry about in a situation where you're worrying about protecting life. You know, you should use numbers that have to do with public health, and not some hypothetical surgical cleanliness. And a key point in that regard is that that there is radioactivity all around us. It's a part of the world. It's a part of the universe. Life evolved in a world that is much more radioactive than our world is right now. All the radioactivity that we are making in all these different programs is not enough addition to overcome the decrease in natural radioactivity just from the natural decay that all radioactive substances do. The Earth is getting inexorably less and less radioactive every year. But so here's where I describe this thing and mention, you know, that these things are not dangerous, and quote as one of the sources of authority the article that a bunch of us wrote in Science magazine. And this, of course, it's written by 19 authors, all of whom are members of the National Academy and are experts in nuclear stuff. And it was peer-reviewed, of course. And the fact that these guys with that experience have this position is worth something. But more than that are the references that they have to the experimental work and so forth that justifies this. And I'll show you an interesting curve. And you look at it at first, and it may be a little confusing, but just bear with me a minute, and I'll show you what it's about. When you are evaluating public safety on a thing like this, what they do often is they take a graph in which going up this way is increasing deaths. We assume that this is a tragedy. This only kills one person. This is 10. This is 100. This is 1,000. And this is how improbable the situation is that would create such a thing. So this says that, you know, there's a fairly good chance that every few years you might have a little accident, and there's an even less chance that you'd have a bigger accident. This goes all the way up to where you're killing hundreds of people, public catastrophe. And that's the way that the curve that they normally looked at, that they said this is how we analyzed, just computer modeling this whole thing. And the skeptics say, well, the approach is okay, but we think it ought to be way over here. And we think when you enter this no zone, that it shouldn't be once in a million years. We think it's more like once in 100 years, which obviously makes a big difference. And so arguing these two things isn't very illuminating. So back about 1970, we started doing experiments where they actually took nuclear fuel. Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's good. And heated it up. Nuclear fuel is a very high temperature ceramic, so it takes a very high temperature to melt it. They would heat it up electrically to melt it, see how much stuff comes off. And it turns out that much less stuff came off than the theoreticals thought would. And then the next question is, well, what happens to it? And the fact of the matter is it doesn't spread very far. The stuff comes out, it hits the cold air, it tends to coagulate and drop out, and there it is. And this is a problem if you inhale it, but it doesn't carry very far. So they came up with a conclusion that the real situation, if you actually measure, I should use this fine instrument that you've been doing, that this curve here says it gets worse and worse, but then it levels off here, and no matter what you do, you can't get much worse than it. Now, that's a very different argument to defend, a very different situation. This says that no matter what you do, you're not going to kill more than this number of people. And actually, these numbers, I should get them on there so you can see them. This is a little fanciful because this is operating on the principle that radiation is harmful all the way down to zero, and that if you cut the amount of radiation in half, you'll cut the cancer rate in half. If you cut it in half again, which is an interesting thing to say from a physics standpoint. And it's a thing that if you just look at radiation hitting a cell and you say every time a radiation hits a cell, it could create a cancer. And so if you get twice as much radiation, you double the chance of getting cancer. That's assuming the human body or any organism is an inert thing. It doesn't react. And the fact of the matter is that it's much more the way the actual situation works. Any substance that challenges an organism can be toxic if you get enough of it, and is harmless at some lower point, and is actually beneficial at the lowest points. Because what happens is that a challenge to an organism that is tolerable strengthens the responses. And you'll find this in everything. I mean, it applies to exercise, it applies to sunshine, it applies to all of the deadly poisons that are in your vitamin pills. Yeah, they're deadly poisons, but you need tiny amounts to stimulate the immune system to respond. So that really changes the whole story. And a lot of guys have commented on that. I've got this article in Physics Today and so forth, which I will skip. But the key point is the two things. One is that when the radiation hits a cell, it damages that cell. But the damage from radiation is 1/10,000,000th as much as the routine damage from just metabolism, metabolizing your food, breathing, and eating. So that the thing that controls whether you're in trouble or not is not whether you got one more gamma ray, it's whether your immune system is operating well. It's exactly the situation when your mother says, you know, you're going to catch your death of cold. She doesn't say, wipe off the doorknob or you might get another germ. She says, put on your galoshes and keep your immune system healthy. And it's the same kind of thing, because the stimulation that the radiation does not only decreases the amount of damage that remains from the radiation damage, but has the same effect proportionally to the damage from metabolism, which is 10 million times higher. So the net effect is that your body is now stronger, and that's an old biological principle. You know, any fights you win make you stronger, and it's true. And in biology, they now talk about the fact that it doesn't make sense to say that any substance is a food, a medicine, or a poison. The dose makes all the difference. And this goes all the way back to Paracelsus in 1540. It says nothing is poison, but the dose makes it so. And you think about it, it makes sense. I mean, you know, what happens when they put a little smallpox in your arm? You know, you don't get sick, you get better. So, and that's why that these tiny amounts of selenium and copper and everything else in your vitamin pills. Just illustrate this briefly, and then we can open up to some questions and things. This is the way that works. The process that I'm talking about, which is something being harmful at high levels and beneficial at low levels, they call hormesis, from the Greek word to stimulate, because that's what's happening. It's stimulating the immune system and the body's responses. So if you look at this thing, if there's red line here is the normal rate of cancer or whatever else is you're measuring, the rate of it in the absence of radiation. You go out here with increasing radiation, and what happens at first, I'm using my magic pointer here, I keep forgetting about this. At first, when you increase the radiation going out here, the cancer rate or whatever it is you're measuring gets lower and lower and lower. You get down here, and you've knocked it down maybe 30% or something like that. And then increasing radiation, it comes back more and more and more, until finally you get back up to where you were here. So all the way up to here, the radiation is beneficial. From here on, it starts getting more and more harmful. So that's the typical curve. And there was a recent article in Nature magazine, which is also a very fundamental magazine, as most of you know, mainstream. And one of the sentences that they've pulled out to flag in a sidebar says, hormetic responses, that is this kind of thing, have equal, if not greater importance for the biomedical and clinical sciences. And that hormesis is not an exception to the rule, it is the rule. And I remember at one thing of toxicologists, one meeting of toxicologists, they said, does anybody know any substance that doesn't behave this way? And there were some 800 toxicologists in the room, and nobody could come up with anything that didn't behave this way, whether it's a nerve gas or a mercury, organic mercury, or any of these things. At small enough doses, they do prove to be beneficial. So in radiation, we have here is a typical sort of a curve on the left there. And you look at this thing and you say, gee, that looks like the guys that say it's a straight line all the way to zero. It sure looks all right to me. Well, there's a little joker in this. This little rectangle in here contains 440 out of the 517 or whatever it was points. So let's expand the thing to look at these 440 points that are all mashed down in the corner. So you do that, and this is what you have. And gee whiz, doesn't that look familiar? But that's buried when you just plot it this way. The point is that people have not been looking. I mean, I've read more than one report in which they said, since there is no reason to expect that radiation would be beneficial, comma, and then they go on, they're going to use a single-sided P-curve and all this sort of stuff because everybody knows that radiation can't be beneficial. So they're used to counting dead mice and not looking for happy mice, you know. And the fact is all the happy mice are over in this corner being ignored. So here's another example of the same thing with a little better data, a little better error bars. And again, you see you get this dip down before it comes back up again. And if you really want to see that on an epidemiological level, they did a 10-year study of workers in a nuclear shipyard. And they've got 700,000 workers in a nuclear shipyard, so they had a good population to work from to get good statistics. And what they wanted to do, the first thing you do when you measure the health of an industrial group is you run into what they call the healthy worker effect. The average worker is healthier than the average guy on this, in total. I was going to say on the street, but some of them aren't on the street. Some of them are sick, some of them are elderly, some of them are just incapable of work for one reason or another. And so you've already got a selection process when you have people who are employed full-time. So that's the healthy worker effect. So they said, okay, we recognize that. We'll get around that. We will compare workers in the shipyard job by job, age by age. We'll take welders at different ages. We'll take ship fitters. We'll take each of these skills. And we'll compare the guys that work in radiation fields with the guys that don't. And this is a very easy statistic because you can't work in a radiation field without getting a radiation badge, and so they know exactly who has worked in radiation fields and who hasn't. And so that there's no healthy worker effect thing. It's welders against welders, age, same age, and so forth. And this is the kind of statistics they got on the thing. And this is deaths from all causes here, and the blue ones are the ones that never did any radiation work. And here are the guys who do radiation work in the red. And the statistical error that you would expect in this thing are those pretty darn narrow little bars there. As you get into smaller groups, the statistical bars get bigger. But I think you can see that epidemiologically. And if you even go to the anti-nuclear guys who come up with some pretty outrageous claims, and you look at their raw data before they start diddling with it, and I challenged the guy publicly on this thing. I said, isn't it true that when you start with your data, that he was looking at guys downwind from an atomic bomb test. And I said, isn't it true that the guys downwind generally have lower cancer rate, greater longevity than their control group that isn't irradiated? Oh yeah, but it's more complicated than that. What he does is he looks at 46 different kinds of cancer. He looks at several different age things. And surprise, some of them are above average. Now, if I saw a statistical thing in which there were no groups above average, I would know right there it was phony. You can't have a situation in which there are no groups above average. So he goes along until he finds one that's above average, and he throws away all the ones that are below average, and he says, see, for this particular cancer, in this particular age group, these guys are getting killed by radiation. So I said, Steve, how about other places? You know, you go to another group, is it the same cancer in the same age group? No, these things are all very different. It's a simple statistical artifact. There was an article in the headline in the Pittsburgh paper one time when some report came out about standing of students, and big headline says half of Pittsburgh students are below average. But let me show you the radon numbers, because this is particularly revolting. This is a guy who did who got grad students, that wonderful class of people that do most of the world's scientific work, to go and measure radon and get county averages of radon in houses, and got these tabulated by counties, and did this for counties that involved 90% of the U.S. population. And then he went and got National Cancer Institute cancer data for lung cancer for those same counties. And he had a huge number of people on the thing. And here's the data he got. This is no radiation cancer level, and this is the going across here is increasing levels of radon. And this says that at very, very low radon, the number of cancer deaths is above the national average, and as you get higher, it gets lower and lower and lower. And that's pretty good statistics. Here is what the guy says. This is the theory that says that it's linear no threshold, as they call it. It's going all the way down. That's the linear no threshold. Here's the actual people. And so you say, what about that? And they say, well, this isn't good. This has got a lot of confounding factors. So they take miners who are breathing diesel fumes and silica dust, and some of them have worked in arsenic-loaded ores and things like that. And they take those guys, and this is what they get. And there is the data. And they said, see, that shows that there is a strong relationship. How many of you guys think you could get by with a paper that was your proof that you have a relationship? Boy, it wouldn't happen in my class. So, what do you think? Are these people who are making these reports just missing this thing? Are they ignorant? Do they not know what's going on? No, it's simpler than that. Here's what they say. The guys who end up, this is the National Council of Radiation Protection, whose job it is to make recommendations on which the regs are based. And what they said is, this is in one of the reports that said, talking about the idea that low-dose radiation, low-level radiation is harmful, okay? Few experimental studies and essentially no human data can be said to prove or even provide direct support for the concept. It is conceptually possible, but with a vanishingly small probability, that any of these effects leading to cancer could result from the passage of a single charged particle. It is the result of this type of reasoning that a linear non-threshold dose-response relationship cannot be excluded. That's the case for it, okay? And they go on to say, in a later report, it is important to note that the rates of cancer in most populations exposed to low-dose radiation have not been found to be detectably increased, and that in most cases the rates of cancer have appeared to be decreased. So they say there's no scientific basis for thinking low-dose stuff is harmful. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the epidemiology, it generally shows the opposite. And then they end up by saying, so we recommend that you assume it's going to be harmful. And you say, what's the basis for that? And they say, gee, as a scientist, I've just got to say, I wish I knew more. I'm just trying to be conservative. I'm trying to be cautious. And there's a very important principle here, because that sounds very, like these guys are really doing the right thing. But the fact is, if you are too cautious, in quotes, if you keep piling up safety factors so that you're totally misrepresenting the situation, then you're not cautious, you're just simply wrong. Just simply wrong. if you, and you saw, you know, if you can get so that people will not use nuclear medicine, which are the life-saving techniques, if you have people who refuse to buy smoke detectors that have that tiny amount of radioactivity in them, because I don't want the radioactivity in my house. These are smoke detectors that the fire chiefs all say are critical for saving lives. And you want to go a step beyond that, you take the Chernobyl accident in Ukraine that was so serious back in 1986. After that, a year after that accident, there were 100,000 additional voluntary abortions downwind of the plant. In other words, these are people who were told by their physicians or somebody that you're going to carry a nuclear mutant, and you sure want to do that. So 100,000 people were told something that is just physically not true, that you know, they were in danger of having a deformed child. And as it goes on, they moved all these people out of the area where they had lived for generations and generations, and suicide and clinical depression and alcoholism and all that stuff is boomed among these poor people. And they won't let them move back to where they evacuated because the ground is radioactive. Well, of course the ground is radioactive. It's radioactive everywhere. The ground around Chernobyl is less radioactive than my sister's front yard. There's nothing unhealthy about that. You know. But those people are just being cautious, and they're driving them to suicide. So it's an additional point that we don't think about much. One, you try to have good scientific proof. Two, you try to be conservative. But the critical thing is that if you pile up these things so that you you characterize something inappropriate. And a good example of that is the idea that you have emergency plans for evacuating nuclear power plants in an accident. And the worst thing you could do, if you thought the air was full of fission products, is to order everybody to go around it. You know, even if it were true that the air was going to be full of fission products, you wouldn't want people to know around it. And the fact is, from the data that I've just been talking about, that the air is not going to be full of fission products. The worst thing that might happen is there might be a few people close in that you ought to move out for a short period. But in general, you won't have any need to move anybody anywhere. We've done this in full scale with 3 Mile Island, quite inadvertently, but there was no environmental damage, no human damage. I probably went longer than I should have here. Let's get some questions. I've been deliberately trying to be provocative, but I'm not trying to sell you something. I'm trying to jar you into asking some questions or making your own comments. But this is the way the situation looks to me, and I welcome any kind of comments that anybody would like to get in. Well, I'll put one more little thought guy up here. This is a quote from Leo Tolstoy in a book he wrote about what is art, but it applies in our field as well. He says, I know that most men, and this is written in a time when most men meant most people, I know that most men, even those who are clever and capable of understanding the most difficult scientific, mathematical, or philosophical problem, can seldom discern even the most obvious truth, if it be such as obliges them to admit the falsity of conclusions they have formed, perhaps with much difficulty, conclusions of which they are proud, which they have taught to others, and on which they have built their lives. And that's what we've got. I mean, we've got guys who have made a whole life of proving that this is a very dangerous field, it's very mysterious, and we've got to have more and more research on it because it's so dreadful. And companies that are making a lot of money taking Earth that is trivially radioactive and running it through all kinds of processes and trucking it someplace else, and this kind of stuff. Billions of dollars are being made on this thing because the fear of radiation right now is more profitable than the utilization of radiation. Anyway, on that happy thought, I will turn the thing over to questions. And I've got more things that might answer some of these questions. So fire away. And please use the mic. I guess.
Any questions? Yes, please use the mic.
I wonder if you could just relate your very interesting talk to your also very interesting title of your talk. I mean, you seem to have a minority position here. Have you been excommunicated or something?
You cannot get people to work on the kind of research that would make this problem even clearer. We put a lot of pressure into trying to get some research money to do some of this work. And Senator Domenici finally pushed through a bill for $10 million a year for 10 years for the DOE to explore the facility. And they very deliberately designed it to handle no epidemiological data, no human data, no animal data. It's all stuff on single cells and that kind of thing that you can't possibly use to give you anything that will affect the real world of regulations. The people who are trying to do this work have been defunded. Papers that have been written don't get published. This one, the shipyard, that was 10 years and several $1 million, and it was just crystal clear what the story was. They wouldn't publish it. And we said, why don't you publish? There's nothing in the contract that says there's supposed to be a final report. Well, they finally got laughed out of that one. So they put this report out. They never submitted it to a refereed journal. They explained, or they didn't mention the result at all, the fact that it actually showed benefit. They said the report showed that there didn't seem to be any significant damage from the radiation, period. And, what about the benefits? Well, that was the healthy worker effect, that's well known. Well, the guy who was in charge of the technical advisory panel was a guy, Arthur Upton, who was formerly director of the National Cancer Institute. And he was the guy